So, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should be a universal law. What's Kant asking you to do? Well, Kant gives us an example at this point. He introduces the case of telling a lie to get what we want, right? And he asks us to ask ourselves what we are basing our action on in terms of a principle when we are trying to tell a lie to get what we want. Well, to isolate the maxim of our actions, right, we might find something like this. Well, when I'm in a rough spot, I will tell a lie in order to overcome that rough spot, right? Well, if we were to take this maxim and universalize it, right? Take ourselves out of it, factor out our own inclinations, the reason we want to do the actions. Well, what we would find is that the maximum would be something like this. When anyone's in a rough spot, anyone ought to tell a lie to get themselves out of it. Right? Now, ask yourself what would happen if everyone told lies whenever they were in a rough spot in order to get themselves out of it or to get what they want. If I know that this is a universal law, I'm not going to believe anything anyone is going to tell me. I'm not going to believe it. I'm just plain old not going to buy it. In that case, if everybody reasoned this way, lies would never work. The reason a lie works is that it's an exception to the rational general rule that says that people ought to tell the truth. Right? So if there were a general rule that excuses lying, that says, just lie, it's fine. Right? In order to get what you want, you ought to lie. Well, when somebody tells me a lie, I'm not going to believe it, and that person's not going to get what they want. Right? So what Kant has done with this first formulation of the categorical imperative is showed us that when we tell a lie, we don't really will that the maxim of our action should become a universal law. We rather take one exception for ourselves just this one time to a general rule, which we already know rationally. It tells us we ought to tell the truth. Right? So when we tell a lie, we already know that we're doing something wrong. Right? And think back to your Socrates. This is more or less what he was arguing, but in less precise terms. Right? We already know that it's wrong to lie. Right? The reason a lie works is that it's a violation of a rule that we all know. Right? So in much the same way, what Kant wants to argue is that we already rationally know the distinction between right and wrong, but the reason we do this, right, the reason we do something wrong is because inclination, rather than reason, influences the will. Right? Now what Kant is arguing in the Grounding to the Metaphysic of Morals is that reason ought influence the will only in moral situations, right? And what these categorical imperatives are designed to do is factor out inclination. But there's a problem with this that Kant addresses in the second section, right? From these self-love moralists who want to claim that this doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because behind all of our actions, behind every action in human history, there's been some element of self-love. I don't tell a lie because I want to get what I want. I want people to believe me long term. I'm nice to people not because it's the right thing to do, but rather because it feels nice to be nice to somebody. Or because then people will do what I ask them to do. Right? I don't cheat on my wife, right? Because I don't want her to cheat on me. I want the relationship to purr along just fine, right? But Kant wants to argue with this, right? And say that the self-love moralists are basing everything on experience. Now, let's even grant that these self-love moralists are right, and in the whole history of human action, there's never been an action occasioned by duty alone, factoring out inclination. Right? What Kant wants to claim is that that shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. Right? Let's even grant that in the whole history of marriages, everyone in the whole history of human coupling has cheated. Right? Kant now rejoins and asks the question, should you cheat on your wife? You can't derive an ought from an is the idea here, right? So perhaps these self-love moralists are incorrect. Now, what Kant wants to do is introduce 4 examples. Right? These 4 examples isolate our duty in particular cases, and in just very general terms I'm going to go over them. The first one is a person who decides to commit suicide, and the second is, well, our case of the fellow who needs to borrow money from the first section. Right? In both cases we've seen in both cases we can see that these are actions that are affecting duty to oneself. Right? The person who wants to commit suicide takes as his principle from self-love. I make as my principle to shorten my life when its continued duration threatens more evil than it promises satisfaction. Kant wants to point out that it seems to be a contradiction in a law of nature that would extinguish life by the very same principle that it serves to stimulate the furtherance of life. Right? So, right at the beginning, there seems to be a rational contradiction, right, in terms of the principle at work in the action here. Right? The same principle that stimulates life, ideally self-love, ought extinguish life. That doesn't make any rational sense. Isolate the maxim of the action. From self-love, one ought make as their principle to shorten their lives when its continued duration threatens more evil than it promises in satisfaction. Right? The problem should be obvious with this one. Right? In this case, if everybody acted according to that maxim, anytime anybody had a bad day, they'd off themselves. Right? Pushing through, working through, surgit, push on, push on. This doesn't line up with the idea of a moral life. So committing suicide is a violation of a perfect duty to oneself. Right? Secondly, another man needs to borrow money, and that he won't be able to repay. And from your page 31, the maxim of the action reads something like this. When I believe myself to be in need of money, I will borrow and promise to pay back the money, although I can never do so. We've already seen how this one works. Right? If this became a universal law, it wouldn't make any rational sense whatsoever. Right? So, this gives us a formula for determining our perfect duty in a particular situation. A perfect duty is informed this is a little bit dancy to explain. A perfect duty is one that is rationally in keeping with the first formulation of the categorical imperative. Right? So, right, if the maxim of your action is at rational odds, if it's a rational contradiction to the first formulation of the categorical imperative, then you have a perfect duty to do the inverse. Right? So, telling the truth is a perfect duty because telling a lie is a rational contradiction when you universalize the maxim of your action. Right? I'll go over this again, just briefly in a second.